Hey, what's up, everyone? Welcome to the first episode of AI CyberSecurity Podcast. This is a audio and video podcast, so you get to see the video as well if you're watching us on YouTube or LinkedIn. I've got Caleb. Hey, Caleb, thanks for coming in, man.
Thanks. This is
Well,
fun.
I'm glad I found you since our trailer, which is like, I thought there would be some memories of not coming back, but I appreciate finding you. But I wanted to maybe lay a land for people who may be listening to this, maybe CISOs, maybe security practitioners. We kind of spoke about what we'll cover in the trailer, but today's episode is a lot more about the primer around what is AI and are we really in the world of AI? Or and you had some thoughts on the whole, I guess, how did you start learning about this as well? So maybe first episode we can focus on how do you think people should approach learning AI?
It's interesting because I started this journey around learning AI, obviously, because I know that this is a wave that's coming. It really lights a fire, like a passion around what to go do. And so when I started going into this journey, I just thought, I'll just post. Like, actually, it was an accountability thing. It was like, you know what? I called it Machine Learning May. I was going to take the month of May and just for 30 days, like learn everything I can from 9 to 4 and figure it out. And so I posted on LinkedIn. I was like, okay, here's what I'm doing, Machine Learning May. Here's the curriculum that I'm going to do, the time frames I'm going to
Oh,
do
wow.
them in, and like just posted it. And then everyone was like, wow, this is what I want to do too. And they're like, please keep me up to date on how as you go through this journey, what matters and what doesn't. And I just said, okay, I'll just do that. And then as I continued to do that, it's fascinating because I became an expert, air quotes, right, at this. Even though I've been only really studying it for like 3 months, right? And I remember this guy, Jim Rivas, who heads the Cloud Security Alliance, and
Oh,
he
yeah.
called me and he's like, Caleb, we're going to kick off an AI security initiative,
Mhm.
and we would love for you to be the chair of this thing. And I'm like, why? I'm not an expert. I've only been studying it for 3 months. And he goes, yes, but 3 months more than 99% of the people that I know. And so it's like, you kind of are an expert in it.
So you're already a veteran in the space by now.
That's right. That's right. And oh, by the way, as if you could do anything in this space, you also learn if you ignore it for 2 weeks, you are way behind and no longer an expert. So
Oh, wow.
that's a whole different topic. So
Yeah. Yeah.
let me tell you about how I approach it. So I thought about, well, how do I communicate me learning some of this stuff? And so the first thing is, how do I approach it? What's my strategy and my framework to thinking about how to approach this? So I built this sort of pyramid. And if you look at the bottom, it's got 4 parts. The 4 parts of the one on the bottom is I need to understand the principles of the technology and the threats. And this is thinking about it like you don't need to be an expert. I don't need to be a data scientist to understand AI. What I need to know is just how the engine works, right?
Mhm.
I by far am not a car mechanic, right? I don't know anything about fixing cars, but I know enough about how an engine works to understand, hey, I shouldn't drive without gas unless it's an electric car, it needs to be charged. And like, in certain engines, you need to have oil and it shouldn't overheat. And there's just things like that that you understand. So you understand how to use it well, and you also kind of understand some risk, even though I'm not a mechanic.
Yep.
Same
Yep.
thing here. I think the foundation is before I start learning anything, I need to understand how the engine works. So what are the principles? First principles approach. How does the AI technology work? Where did it come from? How does it even start? Like, just know the engine. And then by default, since I'm a security oriented person, I've been doing security my whole life. Once you understand how the engines work, you kind of know the threats already, right? You know the
Yeah.
risks. Like, I understand in a car engine, if I don't put gas in it, it's going to run out of gas. And it's not, well, there's a risk. I need to make sure there's always gas. And so similar with technology. And so my foundational layer was start here, understand the engine, understand the principles, then you'll understand the risks.
Yeah.
And then above that stack in the pyramid, the next layer is once I understand that, you can understand the controls, right? So for example, if I know the risks, I know the threats of what's going on, then you automatically know, well, how do I defend against it? Or what are the right controls I should put in place? So then I know the controls inherently. And then the next layer above that is understand the responsibilities. So if I know the controls, then the next question is who manages those controls? Who puts those controls in place? Like who operates those controls? All of those things are about who's accountable for this. So like a good example is, okay, if I know about LLMs and AI, and I know that prompt injection is a threat, then you immediately go to a control. Okay, well, how's prompt injection done? Oh, it's done through user input or done through some sort of side loading of input. All of this comes from like things that we already know as a paradigm, SQL injection and cross-site scripting,
Yeah,
right? Like,
yeah,
and
yeah,
then, oh, well, what are the controls then at which you need? Oh, you need something that monitors the output, something that monitors the input. Great. Who is then responsible for that control? Oh, it's
yeah,
probably going to be the product security engineer, maybe the detection and response team. Like, who is part of all of this then becomes who's responsible. And then you can automatically go to that next layer. And finally,
yeah,
at the very top of that pyramid is understand the policies and process or the governance around this, right? Which is okay. Now that I know the technology, the threat, the control, who's responsible, you start putting in place, then you can understand, well, what should we do? Should we now write a policy that says any LLM always needs to have this control in place that looks for these things, right?
mm,
Like these are the kinds of policies then you start going up the stack, up that pyramid to say this is the policies and controls that need to be built. Now listen, I go bottoms up, right? So I
yeah, yeah,
approach taking at the very bottom and then I make way up to the top. So then by the time I'm writing policies and process, I have a good understanding of what policies and what process makes sense now, right? However, I find a lot of people go the opposite.
I was
They
gonna
start
say,
from the
yeah,
top and go to the
yeah,
bottom and say, well, let's put policies in the process and we'll make it so blanket that you don't even know how it affects the actual threats or actual principles. And I got to be very blunt. I find that happening a lot in
mm,
AI for both good and bad reasons. It's really interesting because it's a con. It's one of the things as cybersecurity people we always ask is we should be really ahead and be early in the life cycle of new technologies, which in AI actually has happened, but almost to a detriment to where we're creating policies and process that we have no understanding of the technologies or risks that are associated with it and are just blanketing it in this fashion, which is inhibiting, I think, both innovation and control because we're starting from the top down as opposed to bottoms up.
yeah,
Now, listen, there's no perfect scenario, right, in all of these things, but it's better that we're at least talking about it and having the conversation than
yeah.
generally what happens in security, which is you come way, way later at the end of the spectrum.
Maybe it's also because we saw a similar pattern when public cloud kind of came in. They're just like policies and procedures first. Let's talk about technology later. And maybe to some extent, it's a good thing we're starting this now so we can help people with the foundation. Because maybe it's the part that scares them, which is I have no idea about this. I'm just going to use policies and procedures to control it. So I'm glad we had this conversation because AI, and maybe this is a good segue into like the different kinds of AI that exist as well. Because it's like depending on what news article you're reading or what blog you're reading, you could be hearing about AGI, ASI, ANI. Then there is the generative AI. Like, what are these?
Yeah. So good segue. Thanks for getting me back on track because I can
That's
talk
okay.
about policies and
No, no. I mean, but you're
that's
right.
for later
It
episodes.
does
That's for
happen. Yeah.
later episodes. Okay, so once I kind of like my first thing when I was going through this process was I was confused about all of the buzzwords,
Mm.
right? Like if you think about someone who doesn't know security, who's first kind of entering the security world and all the acronyms that we've got, like it's
Oh my
it's
god.
it's like overload, right?
Yeah,
Like
yeah. Imagine like I think someone said this thing that security loves acronym, but I realized we're not the only field with acronyms. Like take any
no,
field for that matter. Everyone has acronyms. We just
yeah, they do.
no.
But
So
I
right,
do
all right,
think we're a
continue.
little overboard with acronyms. Like I
Yeah, yeah,
think
yeah. I
we're
think
still leaning a
everything has
little
an acronym,
overboard
or everything has an
on these.
acronym, or it's a next gen
Yeah,
firewall,
that's
next
right.
gen this, next gen that. Yeah.
Next
So
gen that.
so
Yes.
ANI hopefully is ANI is not next gen.
Well, it's next gen AI firewall. And you have to make it an acronym. So it's got to be NAIF. So NAIF.
But apparently, it was funny. I mean, I think you and I laugh at this, but we have been saying this for years. It's funny because it's true as well that in the cybersecurity space, unfortunately, a lot of products have gone down that path where it was almost bastardized to the point that if you heard next gen, like, oh, people are rolling their eyes already.
Yes. And by the way, once you come up with an acronym, you also need some sort of magic quadrant for that acronym. So you have to have a NAIF magic
What?
quadrant.
Who's winning the race? We just want to know who's winning the race. Who's
Yeah.
innovative? who's
Yeah.
not innovative. So is ANI and AGI the
Okay.
acronyms of the AI
Yeah, yeah.
world?
Going back to the point, it's similar. Like, so when I was going into the ML world and learning about machine learning, it's like, when do I say machine learning or when do I say AI? Or when
Yeah,
do I say deep learning versus supervised learning or AGI versus Gen AI? Like, it was just like, I don't know what to say when or how. And so there's a lot of confusion. So actually, my goal number one, I sat through 2 days of this where I just went through trying to collect and understand the acronyms and where they fit.
right.
Right. And so, like, let me give you an example. And so I kind of did a high level view of this so it would help other people. So here's what I learned to kind of put it very, very simplistically. There's this thing called AI, right? Which obviously is artificial intelligence. AI is a destination, it is a goal, right? So when you think about it, what you'll hear most often is, oh, we're going to have AGI, which is basically this thing that they're calling artificial general intelligence, right? That
Mhm.
is the definition. We're going to have AGI. And AGI is the equivalent of, hey, a person or like a grown adult is where AI is. That's the level of mentality. They can be, a 35-year-old plus expert in whatever it is. That's AGI. And it can think, it can reason, it can understand your state of mentality. Like, it is truly an independent, self thinking machine, right?
Right,
Like, it
right.
knows that's AGI. It's a goal.
Okay.
There are actually three states. There is ANI, which is artificial narrow intelligence, AGI, artificial general intelligence, and ASI, which is artificial super intelligence. And so to think about these three, you think about them as sort of areas of leveling, right? So artificial narrow intelligence is where we are today, which is we have very, very narrow specific jobs and functions at which AI can complete and do well. And so most people today's age, we are in artificial narrow intelligence. You don't ever hear people talk about that because it sounds weird and it's not really like cool. But like,
Yeah.
that's what the state is that we are today. And we are trying to head towards artificial general intelligence. That's the goal. However, you could get artificial super intelligence, which is basically like, hey, it's aliens and they are way smarter than us. And at that point, they run the world, right? Like, you're pretty much done. So with the other way to think about this is, I do think there's an analogy around age. And so this is a thing that makes a lot of sense. When you think about children growing up. So for example, you could say that we're in AGI today, but we're in early infancy of AGI, meaning that today an LLM or like GPT-4 is the equivalent of like a 8-year-old who is super, super smart academically,
Right.
right? Like, they have the intelligence of an 8-year-old. They can speak, talk, pass all tests that you could think of from an 8-year-old perspective. Like, for example, 8 months ago, it was at a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old perspective, right?
Mhm.
And the way that I've always thought about it is, although they're an 8-year-old, they're like the 8-year-old who graduated, who got a college degree, one of those like brilliant kids, but may not have very good street knowledge, right? So they're
Mhm.
like, hey, I'm super, super academically smart, but, like, I don't know how to tie my own shoes, kind of 8-year-old, right? Is the way to
Right.
sort of think about it. And AGI can be this spectrum where, as we continue down the road, the goal is to get to a 35-year-old, plus AGI sort of spectrum, where then at that point we really have achieved artificial general intelligence. So that is a goal.
In this episode, I'm gonna pretend to be the CISO listener. So, because you know how every security product out there would say, "Oh, we have AI ML," and you almost go, I mean, I don't want to blame every security vendor out there. I'm generalizing it quite a bit, but when they say AI ML, is that the same as what you're referring to as the narrow ANI?
Yeah. So, like, I think most security products have had some sort of AI, right? So, an example being a machine learning model. So, to
Yeah.
get down to a lower model is like, hey, to get to AI, the techniques to get there are machine learning. Machine
Mhm.
learning is a method to achieve artificial intelligence, right? And so for years, I mean, 10, 20 years, products have had machine learning or artificial narrow intelligence functionality in them, right? Like, when you do spam detection, they're not use regexes and a bunch of if then else clauses. Like, that's not how it works.
No.
Right? Like,
No.
spam detection is clearly using machine learning in some sort of supervised, unsupervised, deep learning. Like there's many different kinds of machine learning, but they've
Right.
created modules that said we're really good at detecting spam. And that is artificial narrow intelligence, right? Which I'm very, very good at taking this one problem and solving it in a really smart, efficient way, right? Which lots of security products have. I mean, when you buy something from Amazon, you're using AI, right? In this aspect.
Oh, it's because that's how it recommends you. Hey, you may like this product as well.
Exactly. Right. Spam, bot detection, when you buy your product, when you're scrolling on TikTok or
Yeah.
Instagram or Twitter, like all of these things are quote unquote artificial narrow intelligence, right? These are very specific models focused on doing very specific machine learning kinds of things to help solve that problem. Artificial general intelligence becomes this more generic thing that says, oh, we are almost like the brain. I can solve many, many problems and not necessarily one specific problem, right? I saw a presentation earlier that I think described it best, which was, what we learned in AGI or through LLMs is language is a broad way of being able to both communicate and express intelligence. And the
Mhm.
fact that LLMs got created, you can now take all the world's knowledge, express it in a language, and then all of a sudden, other things also are languages, like images and photos are language, videos is language, music is a language,
Voice is
like
language as well.
data is a language, DNA is a language, like
Yeah.
all patterns in the world that exist today are a language. And
Yeah.
when you get a model or something that works on language that can do things like LLMs, all of a sudden it becomes very general, right? Oh, it can work for so many different things versus these very, very narrow, specific formulas and mathematical computations that were to solve just spam or just this. All of a sudden, now everything can converge on this LLM technology because
Yeah.
the world operates on communication, and so this is a way to basically be very smart at that, and which makes it AGI, right?
Because you said we are at the early stages of AGI, right? And I think a lot of people may go, "Oh, does that mean LLM is a version of AGI?" But you also mentioned supervised learning, unsupervised learning, deep learning, all of that as well. What are those, and how do they
Yes.
relate to LLM?
So AI is the goal, and so how you get there, it's the how, is machine learning, right?
Mm.
So machine learning is this umbrella that encompasses all these different techniques and approaches to be able to do or achieve some sort of process through neural networks, transformers. You hear all these buzzwords. These are all just maturity of different models. So, for example, you're going to hear buzzwords like supervised learning, which are all associated with these like mathematical models like random forest, linear regression, like all these kinds of things, which you see a lot of in spam, credit score assessments, these kinds of things. Unsupervised learning, sort of like more generic, like how do I predict the weather or social analysis or these kinds of things. And there's deep learning, which really is kind of a little bit of a combination of both of those,
Yeah.
right? Which is
Yeah.
like, how do I, create neural networks? And you're going to hear convolutional neural networks, CNNs. You're going to see reinforcement learning. You're going to see all of these things all are kind of thrown in a bucket, is the best way to say. And it's
Right.
all jumbled up together in order to achieve AI, right? Which is sort of the goal. And of course, all of these things jumbled up in a bucket can be pulled out, and various things can work together in order to produce the best spam bot, or all these things working together can produce the best weather forecasting model.
Mm.
But there are all of these different types of like Lego pieces,
Right.
essentially, that consist of machine learning, right? As the
Interesting.
blocks that you put together in order to achieve what you want. Like here,
Right.
I'll give you a good example. You could take a bunch of those Lego blocks, right? Put
Yeah.
them all together, and then you end up with Gen AI, which is generational artificial intelligence, which basically says anything that produces or creates. So
Right.
this is LLMs. This is like diffusion, stable diffusion in images or video. It's using AI to create things. And it's all these Lego blocks, deep learning, unsupervised, supervised, reinforcement learning, all these Lego blocks put together that kind of go and create this generational
Oh, right. So
intelligence.
it's almost like, to your point, those four, like the general definitions for people who may have been working quite deep in the space, but to what you said as a Lego, You want, oh, I want to build Gen AI, so I'll take a little bit of supervised learning, take a little bit of unsupervised, take a little bit of deep learning. Oh, there you go. I've got Gen AI now. Now, to your point, Gen AI can be further made into something more than almost like a transformer, for lack of a better word. You can transform into a lot more things than just these days. We are, to what you said about language. These days, even people are able to imitate the language, the tone, the translation of words, and all of. I mean, and maybe that's where people get lost a bit. So when we talk about all of that, and then on the one side we have Teslas of the world and Cruise and all the other companies who are doing all this like self automation. Is that AI as well?
I mean, it is, but it's not what people would call AGI, right?
Right.
Because like if you look at Tesla, like they do have, and I believe they just recently did this where everything is now using some sort of LLM, right? But
Oh,
before they were using machine learning models, right? They were
right.
using specific models focused on, image and pattern recognition to determine streets and objects and others. But, I think just recently they were moving everything to where, oh, a LLM like equivalent, which was the AI, is going to be entirely run off of this thing. Right. And
Right.
so it's going to start taking images and the images are being translated into the language at which then a quote unquote large language model makes decisions on. Right. So then it does become a little bit AGI-ish, right? In the
Yeah.
aspect of, okay, if you follow the thought that we are an AGI, we're just early in age of AGI, then
Yeah.
yes. Again, debatable. And listen, I am not, but as I stated earlier, I'm not a machine learning expert and I'm not a data scientist. I'm only regurgitating sort of what I've learned bits and pieces, right?
Yeah, well, that makes it two of us, and I'm definitely not going to claim anywhere that as well. I mean, because AI data has definitely been an interesting, fascinating space to look at from a distance, but now it's in everyone's life. So I'm glad we're getting to have this conversation. Hopefully, if we say anything wrong, people would be kind enough to kind of at least share the right version, and
Yeah.
maybe LLM would be a great one as the second episode because I also wanted to cover things like what's going through your mind in terms of what's hot in the AI world that you're looking at the moment.
Yeah. So, one of the things obviously is Gen AI has created these LLMs, and these things are super powerful and amazing. But yet you see the usage or productive usage of these things being fairly narrow and limited so far. Right. One, I think it's because we're early. Like, it's fascinating to think about this thing really didn't take off until GPT-3,
Yeah,
right? And I
yeah.
think GPT-3 was what, maybe a year ago? I don't
November
know.
last year. Yeah.
Yeah, like, not like and so it's insane the level of steepness of, like, the growth and the capability of the world we live in now versus a year ago where we
Yeah.
were. But what's more fascinating to me is the evolution of where that is going. I get tons of people all the time talking to me about, like, well, what are we cybersecurity LLM AI companies, right? Like, there's all these startups trying to do security of AI. And people are asking, why haven't you invested or started an AI security company? And I was like, I feel like the technology is moving so fast. The LLM that we see today isn't going to be the LLM we see a year from now.
Yep. Yep.
And so I had to put that in a slide. And
Hmm.
so I built this slide where I just kind of put my random guesses, being a non AI expert, but like this is how I want to think about it was okay. When I look at how LLMs are today LLMs are run off of public data,
Yep.
right? That's the data, that's the fuel that feeds it.
Hmm.
The way it's being used today in terms of like how you interact with it is text, right? Through a chat.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then the role that it plays has been largely it creates and informs, right? So you create images, you create articles and books and writing, and you inform it like Google. People are using it as like a Google replacement, right? Like Q&A and discussion, and like it's largely used for this chat text creating and informing model. But then when I think about, well, what's coming in the next 3 months, right? Next 6 months maximum, you look at the kind of data, the fuel that's going to happen is it's going to turn from just public data to enterprise data and to
Hmm.
personal data, right? Like, hey, your personal email, your personal text messages, all of that is going to start feeding into LLMs, right? When you start thinking about how you interact with an LLM, it's not just going to be text. Obviously, it's going to be images too, right?
Yeah.
And not
Yeah.
just images, but video. When I talk to my LLM in a year from now, will it be any different than I could just pull you up like on a Google Hangout call and talk to you?
Yeah.
right? Probably going to be exactly the same. And it will look exactly the same, which is also scary. But like that's how you can interact. It's not just going to be text, it's multimodal, right? So it's text, video, audio, sound, like all these things is how you're going to interact with an LLM. When you think about the role that it plays, I think it's going to start changing from being creating and informing to acting and deciding.
Mm.
And that becomes really powerful when you start saying, wow, LLMs now have, blanket abilities to both make decisions for me and act on those decisions.
Yeah.
It's going to be a whole new world, right? And like, I'll give you an example. I was playing with this tool called Open Interpreter,
Hmm.
which is like a next gen version of Auto GPT, and you sort of root access and full internet onto your machine, and you just say, "Hey, just go do stuff," and it just figures it out. It self figures out problems. It reasons about issues it runs into, and it just gets the job done. And it
Oh,
does this all automatically. And so, like when you give LLMs that level of power of making decisions
yeah.
and executing, one, the the level of capability and power it brings is amazing. And two, it becomes really scary.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like
Yeah. Yeah. I
really
mean,
scary.
deadly
Yeah.
serious. Yeah.
And so finally, the final one, this is the final one. When you think about the future and you think about, okay, the data that it runs on, I think it's going to start running on real time data,
Mm.
right? So when you start thinking about real time data, this is where things start getting really interesting, right?
Yeah.
When you start thinking about how you interact with it, you maybe robotics, right?
Yeah.
Physical, you'll be able to
Yeah. Yeah.
interact with it physically. And then I think the role, once it becomes good at acting and deciding, you'll start moving into managing and operating,
Mm.
right? Which means in my mind, it's acting and deciding at scale, right? Running, hundreds of thousands of fleets of vehicles at a time, making decisions on those vehicles, right? Like operating and maintaining the way the system works.
Yeah.
So, like, when you start thinking about where this goes, and based on our current trajectory, that means that will happen in 3 years.
Oh,
Like,
wow.
you
Three
know,
years.
well, if you think about it, we weren't even a year, and we've gone from where we were at nothing to where
Yeah.
now LLMs are going to be start being a core of every part of product, right?
Yeah.
And
Wow.
innovation is going to start depending upon this. Like there is just so, and listen, like I'm not an expert, but I'm just like, holy crap! Like we're already in multimodal, right?
Yeah.
We're already in enterprise and personal data. We're already on the very edges of acting and deciding,
Yeah.
right? And really, the only reason why acting and deciding hasn't really been pushed that far is for safety concerns and reasons, right? But
Wow.
like we're already, and it's not even a year. Like think 1 year from now, right? Like for
Yeah. Wow.
100%, we're going to be at acting and deciding, no question about it.
Oh, the funny thing is because I was thinking about what's my top of mind for what's hot in AI. And literally 2 days ago, ChatGPT announced that they can now use voice and images as well as a thing. In the first thought that I had, all the CISOs that I spoke to who build policies and procedures around, hey, we'll have an acceptable use case policy, we'll have this, we'll have that, we'll have proxies. Voice kind of like, I mean, how many people check their voice data on their network? I don't
Yeah.
know that many people, companies that do it. And then the other one was I came across, so I think Spotify is working with them as because we have the Cloud Security podcast as well. We've been thinking about like they sample that they can get to a point where they can real time translate this particular podcast that we're recording into you and I speaking German or Spanish. And
Yeah.
imagine like being global from that perspective, like not just English speaking. That's
And,
very real.
and by the way, that's the easy stuff. That's easy.
Well, wait, that's the
That's the
easy
easy
stuff.
stuff. I think about this stuff and I'm like, it's moving so fast.
Yep.
There's no way what you're building today is going to matter and what's going to come in 6 months from now.
Yeah. Yeah.
And like, yeah, to me, and people will hate this, but I think the only way to solve AI security problems is going to be with AI.
Yeah.
And so it'll be interesting to see what happens here in the future. Man, I really should have taken that slide and then posted it so I can point to it because it's now happening, right? Like hey, I said this a while ago, but it really is like going down that road and down
Yeah.
that path. And so to me, I feel like what's happening today is we're taking old security use cases and knowledge patterns and applying it into an entirely different world
Mm.
that may not work. right? It's like I'm taking last year's wrapping of security technology and trying to wrap it around AI. And I'm not convinced that's going to be the right way to solve
Yeah.
this.
And by the way, for context, we've only just spoken about ChatGPT. We did not mention Anthropica. We didn't mention Bard or the version that Meta has, which is open source. We haven't even touched on any of them. We just basically, I guess, scratching the surface just today with the different kinds of AI, or at least hopefully a good starting point for LLM. But I think this could be a great conversation for part two as well, where you can maybe unravel LLM. And you never know, by the next episode, you and I will be talking version 5 of ChatGPT by the next episode.
Yep. Sounds good, man. I'm
Well,
looking forward to it.
awesome. All right. Thanks everyone for tuning in. And you would obviously find us on all the popular podcasts and YouTube platforms and video platforms. But that's what we had for the first episode. Second episode, we'll talk about LLMs and finally get into the whole Gen AI and everything else that's around it. So you can at least start building the foundation, as Kayla pointed out. So thank you for joining, and we'll see you in the next episode.